It was one of those mild, deceptive mornings in late spring when St Mary Mead looked so tranquil that even its gravestones seemed content to rest beneath the elm trees. The sun fell in thin, golden layers over the churchyard, touching the lichen on the old stones and glinting through the iron gates. Sparrows fluttered about the vicarage hedge, and the air carried the distant hum of bees and a faint toll of the church clock. At precisely 9:30, Miss Marple stepped out of her white cottage on Old Mill Lane, gloved and neatly dressed, a basket over her arm, and she was heading, as she did every Wednesday, to place flowers on her late nephew's grave. She moved slowly but surely, the sort of pace that allowed her eyes to notice everything others might miss. The uneven footprint near the gatepost, the faint impression of bicycle tires along the damp edge of the path, the broken stalk of daffodils where someone had stepped too heavily. When she reached the churchyard, she paused. The gate had been left ajar, unusual since old Mr. Cripps, the sexton, was notoriously strict about closing it. Inside, the morning felt different, hushed as though the birds themselves had paused to listen. And then Miss Marple saw it. By the oldest yew tree, where the shadows fell thickest, a man sat slumped against a headstone. His posture was almost prayerful, his chin lowered toward his chest. A small brown bottle lay near his hand, glinting dully in the grass. For a long moment, Miss Marple did not move. Her first instinct was one of quiet pity. There was something desperately lonely in the stillness of his form. But then her sharp, unassuming eyes began to notice small things. His hat, placed neatly beside him, his boots, polished and clean, the faintest trace of disturbed soil near his left foot, as though something had been pressed into the earth and hastily covered again. The sound of footsteps came from the path behind her. Young Tommy Bond, the vicar's errand boy, running breathlessly. "Miss Marple! Miss Marple! It's Mr. Finch! They say he's gone and done himself in." Miss Marple turned slowly, her face pale but composed. "Poor Mr. Finch," she said softly, "though I doubt very much he intended to." As Tommy stared, she looked once more toward the body, her gaze lingering not on the man himself, but on the simple headstone beside him, engraved with the name Clara Finch, 1897-1949. Something, a delicate unease, a whisper of wrongness, brushed across her mind. And though no one in St Mary Mead yet realized it, the peace of their little village had just been quietly, irrevocably disturbed. The news of Mr. Finch's death traveled faster than any official announcement could have carried it. By mid-morning, the hush that had hung over the churchyard gave way to whispers echoing through the cobbled lanes of St Mary Mead. Curtains fluttered in the vicarage windows. Mrs. Weatherby at the post office lowered her voice as she handed over the morning mail, and by the time Miss Marple returned from her visit to the church, a small crowd had already gathered near the green, each offering a theory more dramatic than the last. The general consensus was that poor Mr. Finch, after years of grieving his late wife, had finally succumbed to despair. He had been, as Mrs. Price Ridley gravely noted, a man with too much sadness and not enough company. Mrs. Bantry countered with her own recollection that she'd seen him only the previous day, chatting cheerfully to the new housemaid at the vicarage gate. Miss Hartnell, who prided herself on observing everything from her sitting-room window, insisted she had noticed a stranger loitering near the churchyard the night before. A man in a dark coat, too fine to be local. Miss Marple listened to all of it with her usual quiet attentiveness, seated at the edge of the group, her knitting moving in slow, deliberate rhythm. Her eyes, however, were far away, still in that churchyard, where she had noticed the curious neatness of Mr. Finch's hat and the deliberate placement of that little brown bottle. People who take their own lives rarely think to tidy the scene. They are impulsive, untidy in despair. But Mr. Finch had been meticulous, too meticulous perhaps. Inspector Cray, the stout, red-faced man from Much Benham, arrived shortly after noon. He was brisk and businesslike, and, to the villagers' satisfaction, he treated the matter as a routine suicide. "Poison," he said, standing over the body with a certain professional gloom. "No struggle, no signs of disturbance. Everything points to a simple case of self-administered cyanide." Miss Marple inclined her head politely but said nothing. Cyanide, how dreadful, and yet how precise. It was the kind of thing one might find in a gardener's shed, or perhaps in an apothecary's cabinet. But Mr. Finch was neither a gardener nor a chemist. He had been a bookkeeper, steady, timid, and afraid of conflict. That evening, as the village settled into its uneasy silence, Miss Marple sat by her parlour window, the lamplight soft upon her lace curtains. She thought of Clara Finch's grave and how freshly the soil near it had been turned. The sexton had not done that. She knew his habits too well. Someone had disturbed it recently, perhaps even the night before the death. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was young Tommy again, his face pale in the lamplight. "Miss Marple," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "Mum says I shouldn't be out, but I saw something, down by the churchyard. There's footprints, big ones, and one of the graves has been dug at again." Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-stitch. She rose slowly, her expression unreadable. "Show me, dear," she said softly. "But quietly now. We wouldn't want to disturb the dead or the living." Together they walked through the narrow lane toward the church. The night was still, the air scented faintly of lilac and damp earth. In the moonlight, the churchyard looked silvered and strange. And there, just as Tommy had said, the soil near Clara Finch's grave was freshly disturbed, the edges marked by broad, uneven footprints. Miss Marple bent down, her face grave but calm. A small piece of torn cloth lay half buried in the earth, caught on the root of the yew. She picked it up carefully, holding it to the light. It was part of a man's sleeve. Fine wool, dark grey. Not Mr. Finch's. She looked toward the shadows at the far end of the churchyard, where the path curved toward the gate. Somewhere in the quiet, an owl hooted once and was silent. Miss Marple folded the scrap of cloth neatly into her handkerchief. "No, Tommy," she murmured, half to herself. "Mr. Finch did not come here to die. He came here to find something, and someone made sure he didn't leave alive." Miss Marple did not sleep that night. She sat by her window, the handkerchief folded neatly beside her on the table, the torn scrap of wool within it. The lamp burned low, and outside, the village lay wrapped in quiet, unaware that one of its own secrets had just begun to stir. She thought of Mr. Finch as she had last seen him, his hands resting too carefully in his lap, his shoes polished to a mirror's shine, his face oddly serene. Men who end their lives seldom take such care with appearances. It was a small detail, but Miss Marple had built her life upon such small things. At first light, she went out again. The air was cool and wet with dew, the grass shining faintly in the early sun. She made her way to the vicarage, where she found Mr. Clement already at his breakfast table, reading the paper with his usual air of mild bewilderment. His wife, Griselda, looked up in surprise as Miss Marple entered. "My dear Jane, you're up early. You've heard about poor Mr. Finch, of course." Miss Marple gave a small nod and took the seat she was offered. "I have indeed. A dreadful business, though I'm afraid I find it rather puzzling." Griselda frowned. "Puzzling? I thought the inspector was quite certain. Poison, wasn't it? There was even a note, they said." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured, stirring her tea absently. "But then, people who mean to die rarely write notes that begin with apologies for the inconvenience of their own deaths. Mr. Finch was a careful man, but not a courteous one in that particular sense. And then, of course, there's the matter of Clara." The vicar looked up. "Clara Finch? His wife?" Miss Marple nodded. Her grave had been disturbed. Not greatly, but noticeably. Someone had been there, perhaps looking for something or leaving it. Griselda shuddered. How ghastly. You think it has to do with his death? I think it has to do with his life, Miss Marple replied softly, and with someone who preferred that certain memories remain buried. Before the vicar could ask more, a sharp knock came at the door. Inspector Cray entered, hat in hand, his boots muddy and his temper already showing signs of wear. Good morning, Miss Marple. Thought I might find you here. I suppose you've been hearing the same gossip as everyone else. Half the village is convinced it's murder now. Miss Marple regarded him calmly. And are you convinced it is not? He hesitated, his ruddy face tightening. There's no proof otherwise. The bottle was his fingerprints on it, and that note, his handwriting, clear as day. Ah, yes, said Miss Marple mildly. But you'll forgive me if I wonder. Handwriting can be copied and bottles can be placed. What of the soil near his wife's grave? Cray frowned. I noticed it. The sexton says he hasn't touched it in weeks. Could be animals. Could be, she agreed. But not many animals wear boots with leather soles and leave fragments of fine grey wool behind. The inspector's eyes narrowed slightly. You've been nosing about again, have you? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not nosing, Inspector. Observing. There's a difference. He sighed and pushed back his hat. Well, if you're right, and someone did want Finch dead, I can't see why. He hadn't an enemy in the world. Miss Marple looked out the window, watching the gardener rake the path. That's what people always say, Inspector. But in my experience, it's precisely those quiet, obliging men who provoke the most dangerous resentments. He kept books, did he not? For several households here in the village? Yes. Managed accounts for the estate, the garage, and the grocer's. Then he would have known things, Miss Marple said softly. Things better left unspoken. The inspector looked at her, uncertain. You think he was killed because of that? I think, Miss Marple murmured, that someone feared he might finally begin to speak. As she rose to leave, the morning sunlight caught on the edge of her handkerchief, still tucked neatly in her sleeve. She thought again of the torn fabric, the careful pose of the dead man, and the faint scent that had lingered on the bottle. A bitter almond note that clung even after the glass was empty. The truth, she felt, was already there, hiding in plain sight. And if there was one thing Jane Marple understood better than anyone in St Mary Mead, it was that the most dangerous secrets were always the ones people believed no one else could see. By the following afternoon, the air in St Mary Mead carried that unmistakable tension which always followed tragedy, a kind of polite, whispered unease. In the tea shop, Mrs. Price Ridley's voice carried above the clinking of cups as she recounted her latest version of events, while Mrs. Bantry leaned in, eyes bright with morbid fascination. Miss Marple sat at her usual table near the window, knitting needles moving with gentle steadiness, listening to the flow of gossip as one might study the tide. She knew from long experience that within idle chatter there was often truth, hidden, unintentional, and revealing. It was Mrs. Bantry who first provided the spark. You know, I remember now. Mr. Finch went to see Mr. Gorman, the solicitor, last week. I was at the post office, and I saw him going in. Looked quite agitated, too. Read about the face. I thought perhaps it was about his will, poor dear. Will nothing, snapped Mrs. Price Ridley. It was about that dreadful boy of his. The one who disappeared years ago. Robert, wasn't it? Always in trouble, always borrowing money. Perhaps the shame of it all came back to him. Miss Marple's knitting slowed. Robert Finch. Yes, she remembered. A restless young man, charming to some, insolent to others, who had vanished from the village one autumn evening and never returned. Rumour had it he'd joined some dubious business in London. That had been nearly 6 years ago, just before Mrs. Finch's death. How curious that his father should have paid a visit to the solicitor only days before dying himself. That evening, Miss Marple walked down to the churchyard again. The gates were closed now, the earth around Clara Finch's grave freshly raked. She had made a point to speak with Mr. Cripps, the sexton, earlier in the day. He had confirmed that he found the disturbed soil odd, but had covered it to keep the ladies from talking. He'd also mentioned, quite casually, that he had seen a stranger the night before Mr. Finch's death, a man standing by the lich gate, smoking, silent, watching the path that led to the graves. As she stood there now, Miss Marple noticed something new. Near the edge of the church path, half concealed in the grass, a matchbox lay open, its contents scattered. She bent to retrieve it. It bore the name of a London hotel, one she recognized from the newspapers. The Imperial Regent, a respectable but not inexpensive place. Strange indeed for a man like Mr. Finch, who had never been beyond Bristol in all his life. She slipped the matchbox into her pocket just as the sound of footsteps approached. Turning, she saw Inspector Cray, hat pulled low, his face weary. "Evening, Miss Marple. I thought I'd find you here. I've just come from the solicitors." "You were right, blast it. Finch had drawn up a new will, left everything to his son Robert, the lad who disappeared." Miss Marple met his gaze, her expression thoughtful. "Interesting, isn't it? A man presumed dead or missing, suddenly named heir again, and the father dies conveniently before anyone can ask why." Cray grunted. "We've sent word to London. If the boy's alive, we'll find him. But I'll tell you something, Miss Marple. There's something else that doesn't sit right. The bottle we found. It was marked as cough medicine from Dr. Haydick's surgery. Only the doctor swears he hasn't prescribed anything of the kind for months. The label's genuine, though torn from one of his bottles. Which suggests," Miss Marple said quietly, "that someone took the trouble to imitate the appearance of a harmless bottle to disguise a deadly one. A small but telling effort, wouldn't you agree?" Cray sighed. "You always make things sound simple when they're not." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "They are seldom simple, Inspector, but they are often human. Someone wanted to make Mr. Finch's death appear as his own doing. And yet they left traces. Too many, in fact. The hand that arranges everything too neatly is rarely innocent." She turned toward the church, her eyes following the shadows that stretched across the graves. Somewhere, she felt, was the connection between the grave of Clara Finch, the vanished son, and the stranger in the dark coat. Perhaps it was love. Perhaps guilt. Perhaps something far older, buried in the quiet soil of St Mary Mead. As the evening bell tolled, she touched the edge of the nearest headstone with gloved fingers. "They always think the truth is buried," she murmured, "but it has a way of breathing, even underground." And in that moment, she knew, before long, someone in St Mary Mead would be forced to come into the light. The following morning brought a heavy mist that clung low over the fields, turning the familiar lanes of St Mary Mead into pale, uncertain corridors. Miss Marple stood at her gate, looking toward the church spire, barely visible through the fog. Somewhere within that whiteness, she thought, the truth was shifting quietly into view, waiting for the right moment to be seen. She decided to pay a visit to Mr. Gorman, the solicitor. Her manner, as always, was courteous and disarmingly mild. The clerk at the front desk barely noticed her arrival, and within minutes she was seated across from the elderly lawyer himself, who looked both startled and flattered by her call. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, adjusting his spectacles, "you've come about poor Finch, no doubt. Terrible business." "Yes," she said softly, "but I wonder if you might help me understand a few small details. You see, one hears so much in the village, and I prefer to be accurate before forming opinions." Mr. Gorman smiled faintly, as though accustomed to her gentle inquisitiveness. "Well, yes, Mr. Finch came to me about a week ago, so he wished to make certain alterations to his will. Nothing unusual, save for one thing, he wanted to reinstate his son Robert as beneficiary. I asked, of course, if the young man had returned. He said no, but that he expected to hear from him soon." Miss Marple's knitting bag rested neatly on her lap. "Expected to hear from him soon? That's rather interesting, don't you think? Indeed, the solicitor replied. He said he'd received a letter from Robert. It was brief, written from London, promised a visit before the month's end. And this letter? Miss Marple asked, her eyes lowering to the polished surface of the desk. Do you happen to still have it? I'm afraid not. Finch took it with him, but he did show it to me, yes. The handwriting seemed his son's. A few spelling mistakes, that sort of thing. He seemed greatly relieved, even emotional. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the row of neatly bound ledgers along the shelf. And did he say how he planned to contact his son again? Mr. Gorman hesitated. Only that Robert had given him an address. Somewhere in Westminster, near a railway yard. Odd place, I thought. But I didn't press. Finch was not a man easily questioned. Miss Marple smiled gently. No, not easily, but predictably. And predictability can be the undoing of honest men. When she left the solicitor's office, the mist had begun to lift. The outlines of the cottages grew clearer, and from across the street came the scent of baking bread. Yet Miss Marple walked with unusual swiftness. She had the faint but growing certainty that the letter had never been written by Robert Finch at all. Someone had needed Mr. Finch to believe his son was alive, and had needed him to change that will before arranging his death. That evening, she found Inspector Cray in the vicarage study, staring gloomily at his notes. We've traced the matchbox, he told her as she entered. The Imperial Regent Hotel in London. The staff remember a man fitting Finch's description staying there 2 nights ago. But here's the odd thing. He never checked out. Left his key on the table and vanished. The same day he was seen alive here in the village. Miss Marple's brows rose ever so slightly. How curious indeed. It would seem we have 2 Mr. Finches. One who leaves a London hotel and one who dies in a churchyard shortly after. Cray scowled. You think someone impersonated him? I think, Miss Marple said, that someone wanted to be seen as him, long enough to fetch that letter perhaps, or to plant the bottle. Then they returned here, by night most likely, to finish what had been arranged. She looked toward the window, where the last of the fog drifted past like pale smoke. The real question, Inspector, is not who killed Mr. Finch, but who needed his death to look like sorrow. Cray rubbed his chin uneasily. If you're right, the boy might not be the victim we thought. Miss Marple turned toward him, her eyes calm but sharp. Oh, I think Robert Finch is very much alive, Inspector, and I think he's been home for quite some time, just clever enough to make certain no one noticed. Outside, the church bell tolled softly through the mist, as though marking the hour of revelation drawing nearer. Miss Marple folded her gloves, her voice barely above a whisper. We shall find him soon. The guilty always leave a pattern, and in St Mary Mead, patterns are never overlooked for long. 2 quiet days passed, though in St Mary Mead, quiet was a relative term. Beneath the tranquil rhythm of the village, curiosity burned like an undercurrent. Mrs. Price Ridley had taken to walking past the Finch cottage twice daily under the guise of delivering jam to the vicarage, while Miss Hartnell swore she had seen a light burning in the upstairs window long after midnight. The police had sealed the house, of course, but that meant little to village imagination. Miss Marple, however, was less interested in what was being said and more in what was being overlooked. She had learned, through years of careful observation, that the truth was rarely found in words. It was found in habits. And in the habits of men, deceit always left a trace. That afternoon, she set out toward the Finch house herself, a small parcel tucked under her arm as an excuse for calling. The lane was damp from the morning rain, and the air still held the scent of wet earth. The house stood at the far end of the road, a modest stone cottage with ivy creeping along its sides. Its curtains were drawn, its windows shuttered, yet there was an unmistakable sense of recent use. The faint tracks of boots at the threshold, a small cluster of ashes in the garden grate where someone had burned paper. Miss Marple hesitated only briefly before lifting the latch. She had, after all, known the Finches for nearly 30 years. Inside, the air was faintly stale but not abandoned. On the mantel lay a pipe still flecked with fresh tobacco. On the writing desk, a small leather-bound ledger open to the last page. The neat columns of figures were interrupted by a scrawl of ink, hurried and uneven. Debt paid in full, no more owed. She bent closer, studying the hand. It was firm but uncertain, as though written by someone mimicking another's style. She had seen such imitation before, in the days of ration coupons and forged signatures. The imitation was good, but not perfect. The F in Finch curved differently, and the spacing between letters was too careful. Just then, a noise, a soft creak, echoed from the stair above. Miss Marple straightened, every sense alert. The sound came again, cautious, deliberate. Someone was in the house. She moved toward the hallway, her steps light despite her age. The floorboards groaned slightly, and a figure froze halfway down the stairs. He was young, perhaps 35, with a drawn face and anxious eyes. His clothes were plain, his coat travel-worn, but there was something unmistakable about the line of his jaw, the way his mouth twitched when startled. Miss Marple knew that face. Time and hardship had changed it, but not beyond recognition. "Robert Finch," she said softly. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he exhaled sharply, as though the sound of his own name had broken whatever fragile composure he possessed. "I suppose everyone knows, then?" "No," Miss Marple replied gently. "Not yet, but I imagine they soon will." He descended another step, eyes darting toward the door. "I didn't kill him, Miss Marple. Whatever they say, I didn't. I came back to make things right, to tell him I wasn't the failure he thought I was." She watched him carefully, her voice steady. "And did you tell him?" Robert hesitated. "I tried, but he wouldn't see me. I came that night, stood outside the window. I saw him sitting there, reading. I was going to go in, truly I was. But someone else came first." "Someone else?" He nodded slowly. "A man in a dark coat, taller than me. I couldn't see his face. He went round the back. I waited, but he never came out. I left before morning." Miss Marple felt a chill move through her. "And where did you go?" "To the churchyard," he whispered. "To see Mother. To think. And when I came back, he was dead." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes soft yet searching. "You came back again afterward, didn't you?" "To the grave." He swallowed hard. "Yes. I thought perhaps he'd left something. He always kept things hidden. But when I dug, there was nothing." Miss Marple nodded, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to align in her mind like threads drawn taut. The stranger in the coat, the forged handwriting, the false bottle. Each had been placed with precision, not by a grieving son, but by someone who had long studied the habits of one. When she finally spoke, her tone was almost kind. "You must leave now, Robert. Go to the vicarage. Tell Inspector Cray everything, exactly as you've told me. And please, don't run. People who flee from truth often make themselves guilty of what they never did." He looked at her uncertainly, then nodded, slipping past her and out into the pale afternoon light. When the door closed, Miss Marple stood in the silence, her gaze drawn once more to the open ledger. The ink still glistened faintly. Someone had been here very recently. Someone who wanted the story to end before the truth could be spoken. And as she stepped outside, she noticed something half buried in the mud near the garden gate. A brass button, tarnished, but unmistakably part of a policeman's tunic. Miss Marple turned the small brass button over in her gloved hand, studying its dull gleam in the afternoon light. It was heavy, official, no ornamentation, just a faintly stamped crest. She knew that crest. The county constabulary used precisely that design. which meant that whoever had been at the Finch house last night had not only worn a policeman's uniform, but had lost part of it there. The discovery sat uneasily with her. Later, in the vicarage sitting room, she poured herself a cup of tea, her mind moving with quiet precision through the facts as they stood. The forged handwriting, the disturbed grave, the stranger seen by the sexton, the false bottle of poison, all small inconsistencies forming one unmistakable pattern. Someone had orchestrated this with deliberate care, and now the presence of that button confirmed what she had begun to suspect. This was not merely a village quarrel or a crime of passion. It was something planned from within the very circle of those meant to preserve order. When Inspector Cray arrived not long after, his manner was unusually brisk. He had heard from the vicar that Robert Finch had surrendered himself earlier that morning. "He's in custody now," Cray said, lowering himself into a chair. "Claims innocence, of course. Says he came back to see his father, found him dead, lost his nerve, and ran. Convenient story, if you ask me." Miss Marple regarded him quietly, and yet not an impossible one. Cray frowned. "We found no sign of another man, no footprints other than Finch's, no weapon beyond the bottle. Everything points one way." "Everything," she repeated softly. "Except the truth." He looked at her sharply, irritation flickering. "You think I've missed something?" Miss Marple reached into her bag and placed the brass button on the table between them. "I think, Inspector, that someone is very keen for you to believe you found everything. This was by the garden gate at the Finch house." Cray picked it up, turning it over in disbelief. "That's regulation issue, from our own uniforms." "Yes, which would explain why no one thought twice about a man in such a coat being seen near the churchyard. A uniform, after all, inspires confidence, doesn't it?" The inspector's expression darkened. "You mean to say one of my men?" "I mean to say," Miss Marple replied gently, "that whoever wore that button wished to appear as one of your men. Perhaps he was. Perhaps he only needed to seem so. Either way, it would allow him to move about unseen, unquestioned, even in the dead of night." Cray sat back heavily, his fingers tightening around the brass. "There's only one constable stationed here. Miller, young fellow, eager. Been assisting me since the start." "Ah," said Miss Marple, "and how fortunate for him, being the first on the scene of a supposed suicide." Cray looked up sharply. "You think Miller's involved?" "I think," she said slowly, "that he knows far more than he's said. And if I'm not mistaken, the person who forged that letter to Mr. Finch would need access to police reports, old case files, perhaps even the original handwriting samples from Robert's disappearance years ago. You see, Inspector, it takes a certain kind of man to counterfeit grief so convincingly." For a long moment, Cray said nothing. Then he rose abruptly, muttering that he would speak to Miller himself. But Miss Marple stopped him with a quiet hand on his sleeve. "No, Inspector. If he's guilty, he'll be watching. And if he's innocent, he'll need to believe he isn't suspected. Let him come to you first." Her voice was low, steady, almost kind. Guilt reveals itself not through fear, but through relief. Wait for the moment he thinks he's safe. That evening, as the mist returned, to settle over St Mary Mead once more, Miss Marple stood at her window and watched the lamplight flicker along the narrow street. Somewhere, she knew, young Constable Miller was pacing, restless, uneasy, caught between what he had done and what he feared might be discovered. And when, just past 9, she saw the faint silhouette of a man crossing the green toward the Finch cottage again, she knew her waiting was over. Miss Marple waited until the shape disappeared into the shadows near the Finch cottage before reaching for her coat. She moved quietly through the garden gate, her steps light and measured. The air was cool and damp, the faint scent of rain mingling with the lingering smoke of hearth fires. Across the village green, the outline of the cottage seemed smaller in the mist, almost swallowed by it. But a faint glimmer of lamplight moved behind one of the windows, flickering, then steadying again. She approached slowly, pausing by the low hedge. The front door stood slightly ajar, just as it had the day she'd found Robert. The same faint smell of damp earth hung in the air, and beneath it, a sharper tang. Matches, perhaps, or lamp oil. Inside, a single lamp burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. Constable Miller stood at the writing desk, his back to the door. He was bent over something, his movements quick, agitated. Miss Marple waited a moment, then spoke softly from the threshold. "It's very late for tidying up old papers, Constable." He spun round, his face pale, a nervous smile flickering there for only a second before vanishing. "Miss Marple, what on earth are you doing here? You shouldn't be out at this hour." "I might ask you the same," she said, her tone mild but unyielding. Her eyes drifted to the desk. The ledger lay open again, and beside it, a half-burned sheet of paper in the grate. The handwriting was unmistakable. Robert Finch's supposed letter from London. Miller's gaze followed hers, then darted away. "I was just checking evidence," he said too quickly. "Inspector's orders." Miss Marple nodded gently. "How conscientious of you, and yet I wonder, would the inspector also have ordered you to destroy that letter?" His expression faltered, and for a brief moment the room was filled only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock. Then his voice, lower now, uncertain. "You don't understand, Miss Marple. It wasn't supposed to go like this. Finch was already sick. Everyone knew that. He'd been talking about ending things for months. I thought it might be better if it looked peaceful. Clean. Peaceful," she repeated softly, stepping closer. "So you helped him die?" He shook his head sharply. "No, I didn't mean for him to die. I only wanted him frightened. He owed money, bad people in London. I was meant to get what was left, just enough to make it right. But he wouldn't listen. He said he'd gone to the solicitor, changed his will, back to that useless son of his. All for nothing." Miss Marple studied him in silence. His hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from exhaustion, the kind that comes when guilt begins to settle in the bones. "So," she said quietly, "you thought if you frightened him, he might sign another document, perhaps a note of debt, but he collapsed instead." He swallowed hard. "I panicked. I found the bottle, thought it'd be easier if it looked like suicide. I wrote the letter later, made it look like the boy's. No one would question it, not with his reputation." Miss Marple's voice was almost kind. "But you didn't realize Robert Finch had returned?" Miller's eyes widened. "He's here." She inclined her head slightly. "At the vicarage. He told the inspector everything. I imagine they'll be along soon." For a long moment the young man stood frozen. Then, with a faint sound, half laugh, half sob, he sank into the nearest chair. "I didn't want this," he murmured. "He was already dying, you know. Heart weak as paper. I just wanted to frighten him into paying what he owed. I thought it would all end there." Miss Marple looked at him with quiet sadness. "Evil seldom announces itself, Mr. Miller. It begins in excuses, in just this once. And before long, one is arranging the death of an old man who trusted too easily." Outside, footsteps crunched on the gravel. Measured, official. Inspector Cray's voice called her name. She turned toward the door, her expression calm once more. "In here, Inspector. I believe your constable has something to tell you." As Cray entered, Miller rose, shoulders sagging, and surrendered without a word. The lamp flickered again, and for a moment its weak light fell on the open ledger, the last page still marked with the words "Debt paid in full." Miss Marple closed it gently. "Yes," she murmured, half to herself. "I suppose it is." And outside, the church bell struck 10, the sound carrying softly across the sleeping village. Solemn, final, and perfectly at peace once more. The next morning dawned pale and still, as if the village itself were holding its breath. A light drizzle hung in the air, softening the edges of St Mary Mead and washing away the last traces of the night's turmoil. The Finch affair, as people had already begun to call it, spread swiftly through every lane and parlour. By the time Miss Marple walked to the greengrocer's that morning, the whole of the High Street buzzed with sympathy, outrage, and the peculiar satisfaction that only scandal can bring. "Imagine," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed as Miss Marple passed her near the bakery. "A policeman of all people, though I always said he had shifty eyes. Never trusted a man who blushes when you ask about the weather." Miss Marple smiled faintly, adjusting her gloves. "I dare say, my dear, that blushing has condemned more men in this village than evidence ever has." She moved on, without lingering, her thoughts elsewhere. For though the case seemed neatly resolved, something still troubled her, an uneasiness that refused to be dismissed as habit. At the vicarage, Inspector Cray was finishing his report. He looked tired, but satisfied. "We've sent Miller to the county jail," he said as Miss Marple entered. "He confessed enough to satisfy the magistrate. The poison came from an old police evidence vial. He lifted it weeks ago, meant to scare Finch into paying him. It all fits now." "Almost," Miss Marple said softly. The inspector frowned. "Almost?" She walked to the window, looking out toward the churchyard. "You see, Inspector, there's one small matter that doesn't align. Miller claimed Mr. Finch died in panic, that his heart gave out when frightened, and yet the coroner's report confirmed traces of cyanide. That means someone made certain the death was not merely fright." Cray's brow furrowed. "He must have forced the bottle into Finch's hand afterward, made him drink it." "Except that cyanide leaves marks," she said quietly. "Tissue burns, discoloration, the unmistakable smell. No, Inspector, Finch never drank that poison. It was placed there after he was already dead. Which means Miller's story, while useful, was not complete. Someone else finished what he began." Cray stared at her, then shook his head. "You're saying there's another one involved. But who? He acted alone." Miss Marple turned from the window, her expression calm, her eyes sharp as glass. "Did he? Who fetched the original bottle from the evidence cupboard? Who replaced it with harmless liquid to make the exchange seem plausible when checked? And who would stand to gain if Miller took the fall?" The inspector's color faded slightly. "You think one of my men higher up?" "I think," she said gently, "that corruption has a way of climbing stairs. Miller was frightened, foolish, easily guided. But someone clever enough to set him in motion, someone who knew the patterns of your work, your schedules, even your handwriting, used him as cover. The brass button was never an accident, Inspector. It was a message. To you." The room fell into silence. Beyond the walls, the faint toll of the church bell marked the hour, echoing through the mist. Cray ran a hand through his hair. "Good Lord, Miss Marple. You mean they planned to destroy him and the Finch case, all to hide something else?" She gave a small, sad smile. "Not destroy, Inspector. Bury. Just as they did with poor Clara Finch's grave. The soil was disturbed twice, you remember. Once to plant deception, and once to test whether anyone was watching. When Robert returned, that plan began to unravel." He stared at her. "Then what do we do?" Miss Marple folded her hands neatly before her. "You must find who signed the requisition for that evidence vial, and when you do, you'll find the hand that truly wrote Mr. Finch's death." By evening, the village lay once more under quiet drizzle. But inside the station, papers rustled, telegraphs clicked, and the inspector's voice rose sharply through the walls. Miss Marple, back in her parlour, stirred her tea and listened to the rain tapping against the glass. She felt no triumph, only the familiar, melancholy awareness that the face of evil was seldom as dramatic as people imagined. Sometimes it wore a uniform, sometimes it smiled from a pew on Sunday morning, and sometimes it waited patiently, like a seed beneath the soil, until someone else came along to dig it up. She set her cup down, the faintest sigh escaping her lips. "It never truly ends," she murmured, "only changes its name." The following afternoon brought no rain, but the sky remained overcast, the kind of dull pewter grey that made the roofs of St Mary Mead seem lower and closer than usual. The village had quieted again. Gossip had begun to subside into something softer, relief mingled with curiosity. Most people believed the case closed. Miller's arrest, after all, had satisfied both justice and conversation. But Miss Marple knew the air had not yet cleared. She could feel it, a faint tremor beneath the ordinary rhythm of things. When Inspector Cray called upon her that evening, his face was drawn and his hat clutched in both hands. "You were right," he said without preamble. "The requisition for that cyanide vial was signed 3 weeks ago by Sergeant Dodd, my superior. I checked the log myself. The bottle was never meant for disposal. It was marked for testing." Miss Marple inclined her head, unsurprised. "And yet, it found its way into Miller's pocket." He nodded grimly. "Dodd claims he never saw it after that day. Says Miller must have stolen it." "I expect he would say that," she murmured, motioning him to sit. "But you see, Inspector, there's one difficulty with that. Miller's handwriting was careless, untidy, unformed. The forged letter to Mr. Finch was neat, deliberate. Someone accustomed to official forms and patient deception. That suggests someone like Sergeant Dodd, not a young constable too frightened to spell his own name under pressure." Cray stared at her for a long moment, the weight of her reasoning sinking in. "You think Dodd used Miller?" "I think Dodd needed Miller," she said softly, "to play the fool, to make the scheme plausible. Mr. Finch's death silenced a debt. Yes, but also a record. You'll find that the Finch ledgers, the ones seized by the station, contain an entry that doesn't belong, a payment marked to a Mr. D dated 2 months before the death. Perhaps for protection, perhaps for silence. But in either case, Finch knew something that made him dangerous." Cray's jaw tightened. "And Dodd finished what Miller started." "Precisely. He let the boy take the blame, certain he'd panic and confess halfway. A tidy conclusion, a quiet village, and no reason to look higher." The inspector rose abruptly, his face pale. "Good Lord, Miss Marple, you're describing corruption right in my own ranks." She smiled faintly, with the gentlest trace of melancholy in her expression. "I'm afraid corruption doesn't favor one rank over another, Inspector. It's simply a matter of opportunity." He hesitated, then said, "I'll go to him now." She nodded once. "Do be careful. Desperate men often mistake confession for escape." When he left, Miss Marple stood for a moment by the window, her gaze drifting over the churchyard beyond. The yew trees were dark against the dimming sky, their shadows stretching toward the graves like quiet secrets. She felt, rather than saw, the final motion of events beginning to turn. An hour later, the stillness of the evening was broken by the echo of hurried footsteps on the lane. From her open window, Miss Marple caught the sound of raised voices, then a single, muffled cry. By the time she reached the door, Inspector Cray was standing in the road, his face white as chalk. "He's gone," he said hoarsely. "Dodd shot himself, left a note confessing it all. Finch, the ledgers, the poison. Everything." For a long moment, Miss Marple said nothing. The church bell began to toll again, slow and distant, the same mournful rhythm that had accompanied Mr. Finch's funeral. She looked up at the grey sky and spoke softly, almost to herself. "Evil doesn't vanish when it dies, Inspector. It leaves a residue, a quiet stain in the air that lingers after all else is settled." Cray removed his hat, his voice low. "Then what do we do?" Miss Marple's eyes moved toward the churchyard once more, where the mist was beginning to rise again among the stones. "We bury the dead, Inspector," she said gently, "and we pray the living remember." The wind shifted through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of lilac from her garden. Somewhere, far off, the clock struck 9, and St Mary Mead, its secrets briefly laid bare, sank once more into its habitual peace, leaving only one elderly woman awake, quietly knitting by lamplight, her mind tracing the pattern of human frailty as deftly as her hands traced the thread. The next morning broke clear and cold, as though the village had been washed clean overnight. Yet beneath the crisp air, St Mary Mead carried a peculiar unease. People spoke softly in shops, glanced toward the churchyard as they passed, and quickened their steps without meaning to. The affair had ended, or so everyone said, but endings in such places rarely stayed neat. The dead had been buried, yes, but the living were still adjusting to the quiet that followed. Miss Marple felt that quiet most keenly. She sat by her breakfast table, the newspaper folded neatly beside her, her tea cooling as her mind retraced the threads of the past days. Justice, she thought, was seldom tidy. The official story would say that Sergeant Dodd took his own life out of guilt. It was plausible, convenient, and therefore accepted. But the truth, as always, was far more complex. Dodd's note had been detailed, too detailed. The tone too formal, the phrasing curiously careful. It was a confession, yes, but also an absolution written by someone expecting it to be read aloud. And that, Miss Marple thought, was not the way a man writes before ending his life. By noon, Inspector Cray came to see her once again. He looked older than he had a week before, and his voice was low, almost weary. "I've just come from the station," he said, removing his hat. "The superintendent's closed the file. Dodd's death puts it to rest. The coroner's satisfied, and the county wants no further scandal." Miss Marple poured him tea. "Quite understandable," she said gently. "The village can only bear so much excitement." He gave a grim little laugh. "You don't think it's finished, do you?" She looked at him over her cup. "No. I think Sergeant Dodd was clever enough to tidy the papers, but not clever enough to cover every trace. You see, Inspector, one can forge a letter, or falsify an account, or even copy a man's handwriting, but one cannot change the pattern of his thoughts. The confession sounded like Dodd, but the details belonged to someone else." Cray frowned, leaning forward. "Someone else? Who?" "The one who gave him the means," she said softly. "Dodd handled the arrangements, yes. But the idea, the opportunity, and the motive belonged to another. Someone who benefited not from Finch's death, but from what Finch knew. Ask yourself, Inspector, who stood to gain by ensuring the Finch ledgers disappeared entirely after the investigation?" He went still. "The county treasurer," he murmured. "Finch kept his accounts." Miss Marple nodded once, almost sadly. "A man whose office depends upon quiet obedience and whose reputation could not survive exposure. Dodd was his hand, Miller his mask, Finch his liability, and now all three are gone, neatly, as if swept from the board." Cray rose slowly, his expression troubled. "If that's true, we'll never prove it. There's no evidence left." "There rarely is," she replied, her tone as mild as ever. "But truth, Inspector, has a way of surviving in the minds of those who watch carefully. The treasurer will live with his peace, and you will live with your doubt. As for me, well, I shall go on watching. People reveal themselves given time." He stood at the door a long while before leaving, as if reluctant to let the conversation end. When he was gone, the house grew still again. Miss Marple sat quietly, her hands resting on the folded paper. Outside, children's laughter drifted faintly from the green, mingling with the distant toll of the church bell. She thought of Mr. Finch, of Robert, of Dodd and Miller, each thread woven into the tapestry of human frailty. The tragedy of St. Mary Mead had not been greed or deceit, she reflected, but the simple, persistent illusion that one could ever bury a secret deep enough to keep it from the light. The kettle began to whistle softly, pulling her from her reverie. She rose, smiling faintly, and set about preparing another pot of tea. The day, after all, would go on, just as it always had in St Mary Mead, where sin and sorrow came and went as quietly as the wind between the yews. And in that peace, Miss Marple sat once more by her window, knitting steadily, her eyes watching the world beyond the lace curtains with the gentle patience of someone who knew that every story, no matter how finished, always leaves one stitch unknotted. A week passed, and with it, the illusion of calm began to settle once more over St Mary Mead. The church bell resumed its unhurried rhythm, the lanes smelled faintly of lilac and coal smoke, and villagers began to speak of the Finch affair as something distant, one of those unpleasant episodes that in time folds neatly into memory. Miss Marple, however, knew that the village's peace was a fragile thing, resting more upon silence than resolution. The true current beneath it all had not yet stilled. One evening, as dusk softened the edges of the cottages, a knock came at her door. She rose from her chair, setting aside her knitting, and found Robert Finch standing hesitantly on her threshold. He looked worn, but composed, a man trying to rebuild the outline of a life that had once belonged to someone else. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, removing his cap, "I wanted to thank you. Inspector Cray told me. Well, if not for you, I might still be in a cell." She smiled kindly. "Nonsense, my dear. The truth simply has a way of finding those who stop running from it." He hesitated, then stepped inside at her invitation. The small parlor smelled of tea and lemon polish, its calm warmth a stark contrast to the uncertainty still flickering in his eyes. "I've been through my father's papers," he said, lowering his voice. "They gave them back after the case closed. I found something strange." Her eyes brightened slightly. "Strange, Mr. Finch?" He unfolded a small piece of notepaper, yellowed and creased at the edges. "It's a letter, unsent, written to someone named E.T. I don't know who that is. It's in Father's handwriting, dated a few days before he died. He wrote, 'I can't keep quiet any longer. The sums don't add up, and if I sign again, I'll be complicit.' That's all. No signature. Just that." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the paper. "E.T.," she murmured softly, the initials turning over in her mind. Not a name one would forget easily. Robert frowned. Could it be a person in the accounts? Someone connected to the Treasury? "Perhaps," she said, her tone measured. "But perhaps not. Men in positions of trust often conceal names behind initials. E.T. might be a partner or an employer, someone your father was too cautious to name openly." She folded the note carefully. "May I keep this for a day or two? I should like to think on it." He nodded. "Of course. I want to understand why he was killed. It wasn't only money, was it?" Miss Marple's voice softened, almost wistful. "No, Mr. Finch. Money may tempt the wicked, but fear sustains them. Your father's death was not about greed. It was about someone terrified of being seen." After he left, she sat in the fading light, the letter before her. The initials gleamed faintly in the lamplight. E.T. Neat, deliberate, and somehow familiar. She thought of the county offices, of the quiet, self-assured treasurer whom everyone respected. Edmund Tavers, E.T., the man whose books had never once been questioned, who had overseen every financial matter from the parish fund to the constabulary's budget. Miss Marple rose and crossed to her writing desk. She penned a brief note to Inspector Cray, asking him to call upon her the following morning. As she sealed the envelope, she allowed herself a small sigh. She had hoped the village might rest, that the shadows had finally withdrawn from their quiet lanes. But evil, she had learned long ago, never leaves politely. It lingers, revisiting its work under new disguises. Outside, the first stars were appearing above the dark line of the yews. Miss Marple watched them a long while before turning down her lamp. Somewhere beyond the calm of the night, another truth waited, patient and deliberate, just as it had before. And as she settled once more into her chair, her knitting laid aside, her eyes glinted faintly in the lamplight, calm, sharp, and knowing that the story of St Mary Mead was not yet finished. The morning of Inspector Cray's visit arrived crisp and still. A faint mist hung over the hedgerows, and St Mary Mead's cottages stood in their usual quiet alignment, betraying nothing of the unease that still lingered beneath their roofs. Miss Marple had been up since dawn. The note from Robert Finch lay on her small writing desk, the initials E.T. circled neatly in pencil. She had no appetite for breakfast. Instead, she busied herself with a pot of tea, the comforting ritual of it keeping her thoughts measured and sharp. At 8:30, the sound of boots approached along the gravel path. Inspector Cray entered with his usual blend of courtesy and fatigue, his expression already clouded by a weight of bureaucracy. He removed his hat and stood awkwardly near the window, as though reluctant to disturb the serenity of her room. "I received your note," he began. "You mentioned a name." "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly, handing him the letter. "Edmund Tavers, your county treasurer. The initials match, of course, and I believe this letter suggests Mr. Finch uncovered something irregular, something that tied his bookkeeping to a larger sum gone missing. Perhaps your constabulary funds, perhaps the parish accounts. I suspect Mr. Tavers asked Dodd to persuade Finch to forget it." Cray's brows furrowed. "You think Tavers ordered it?" "I think," she replied, "that he facilitated it. Dodd lacked imagination but not loyalty. He would have done anything to protect his patron. Finch's death was intended to silence embarrassment, not to conceal a crime. That's what makes it so dangerous. It was done not for greed, but for reputation." The inspector sank into a chair, the weight of understanding pressing him down. "There's no proof, Miss Marple. Tavers is well connected, respected by the magistrates. I'd be laughed out of the county office if I brought him in." She smiled faintly, her knitting needles clicking softly in the quiet. "Proof is often a matter of patience, Inspector. I find that guilty men, when cornered by quiet knowledge, begin to prove themselves without realizing it." He looked up. "You mean to provoke him?" "I mean to let him provoke himself," she said gently. That afternoon, as the clock struck 3, Edmund Tavers arrived in St Mary Mead. His carriage stopped by the church gate, a rare visit for so distinguished a man. Miss Marple saw him from her garden and, as if by chance, stepped out to greet him. His manner was polished, his smile too precise. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat, "I hear you were quite invaluable in solving that dreadful business with poor Finch. Remarkable, really, how such wickedness hides in plain sight." "Indeed," she said pleasantly. "Wickedness hides best in places where goodness is assumed." He laughed lightly, but his eyes flickered. "Quite so, quite so. Still, a comfort to know the matter's settled. I only came to see the vicar about some parish expenses. Tedious work, but necessary." "How admirable," she murmured. "One must always account for the little things. Even a shilling misplaced can become a scandal, I'm told." For the briefest moment, his hand tightened on his hat brim. "A scandal?" "Oh, yes," she continued, her tone as mild as ever. "Mr. Finch thought so too. He even wrote about it, didn't he? Before he died. Something about not being able to sign a false account." Tavers froze. His smile faltered just enough for the truth to breathe between them. "I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple regarded him kindly, almost sadly. "Oh, I think you do. And I think you'll find, Mr. Tavers, that letters have a way of surviving even when their writers do not." He drew himself up, attempting composure, but his pallor betrayed him. "You're mistaken, Miss Marple. Entirely mistaken." "Of course," she said softly. "Do forgive me. My memory for names isn't what it used to be. though I do recall that E.T. has such elegant handwriting, almost identical, in fact, to the signatures on those county ledgers." His eyes met hers, wide and uncertain, before he turned sharply and walked toward the church, his steps unsteady on the gravel. Miss Marple watched him go, her expression unreadable. She knew that guilt rarely burst forth in confession. It leaked slowly through the cracks of composure, and men like Edmund Tavers could not bear the sound of their own silence. By dusk, a telegram arrived at the vicarage. Edmund Tavers had collapsed in his office, the message read, after locking himself inside. When they broke the door, they found him at his desk, an empty bottle of laudanum beside his hand and a single sheet of paper folded beneath it. A confession addressed to Inspector Cray. Miss Marple stood at her window as the church bell tolled once again, its echo fading into the quiet fields. She said nothing, only folded her hands together and whispered a small prayer. Not for the dead, but for the living who would never learn that beneath the calm of St Mary Mead, sin was not rare at all. It merely wore good manners. The end.